This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 133. Is the euro to blame for European disunity?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, the euro. Is it the main problem with Europe? And if we didn't have it, would the EU be a better place to live? And perhaps, would we still want to be part of it? This week we ask, is the euro to blame for European disunity? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, the euro is 20 years old this year. It was launched by the Maastricht Treaty, of course, and Jean-Claude Juncker kicked this year off with a tweet saying how the euro has delivered prosperity and protection to our citizens. It's become a symbol of unity and sovereignty and stability, which all sounds pretty good, but I think he might be the only person on the planet who believes all this. But Steve, if the euro didn't exist, would we have Brexit, do you think?
No, I don't think we would have Brexit, because a major factor behind why people voted for Brexit was the impact of people coming to the UK under the free movement, because the economies they lived in were tanking. The worst example, of course, was Greece, so there aren't that many Greeks to make the move. So what people would have found more often would be some Spanish. I certainly found quite a few Spanish waiters working around town. All very good if people are moving because there's vacancies in positions and they enjoy the weather in England better than they enjoy it in Spain. Of course, anybody who did that would need their head read. So what is actually moving is the push factor, which Wynne Godley identified brilliantly in 1992, just after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which Jean-Claude Juncker said it was the most important signature he ever made. And I suppose in the same sense as signing your own death warrant, that is a pretty important signature. He said that if a region has no capacity to fiscally stimulate and has no recompense for effectively a trade deficit, the only options facing are terminal decline with migration, emigration, or death. The only way out.
And in Greece, of course, we're seeing that net emigration. There's more people. I mean, we were seeing quite a big reduction in the population of Greece. But it's all relatively recent, isn't it? Because until 2008, things weren't doing too badly. We were seeing growth right up to 2008. It was really the global financial crisis that changed things. And that seems irreversible. So why? Because until then, it looked fine, didn't it?
I suppose the basic analogy I can give is a bit like saying a boat with huge holes in the hull works fine so long as it's going fast enough for the hydrofoils to work and take you above the waterline. As soon as the global financial crisis hit, bang, you hit waterline and start sinking. And it's not so much sinking, it's the captain deciding the best way to manage the boat is to hit more holes in the side so it takes in more water. It is just an insanely badly managed, badly designed monetary system. And if you take a look at the data, and of course that's one of my fixations, what has actually happened has been the euro appeared to be working between 2000 and 2008, because across that period of time, the countries that were running trade deficits within the euro, of course that involves Greece and Spain and Italy to some extent, certainly France as well, they were compensated by enormous borrowing, mainly from French and German banks. The whole free movement of capital thing meant that the lack of stimulus from the government side by the enforcement of the 3% maximum government deficit rule, the lack of that was made up for by a gigantic increase in the level of private debt. And it's just in every last country where the euro is in operation, right, and the country's running a trade deficit.
So why can we blame the euro for that, though? Because we see private debt racking up in lots of other countries, like, of course, Australia.
Oh, yeah, we do. And the thing is, what that meant was that while, and this is a global phenomenon, this is what they call the Great Moderation, was actually a debt-driven, a credit-driven boom in the global economy. So it's not just the euro that experienced that. It was, as you say, it was pretty much a global phenomenon. The thing is, it all worked fine until you hit the crisis. Now, when the crisis hits, to give an idea of the scale of the stimulus that America went through, the level of spending in what you might call the Obama stimulus was equivalent to 4 to 3 times the size of the New Deal. We all know how important the New Deal was to America. Yeah, there are some Austrians who challenged that, but that enormous stimulus from the government spending made up for the fact that the private sector was massively deleveraging in countries like America. So you went from credit demand being 15% of GDP before the crisis to -5 after, but then it very rapidly recovered to back up by 2010. It was positive again, and you had stimulus from the private sector spending as well as stimulus from the government sector spending. But that wasn't possible in the countries that were tied to the euro. So to give you a comparison, Spain was by far the most extreme example of this. Just to give you start with America's data first of all. In America, the level of private debt, which is the change in private debt, which is what creates credit, that reached 15% of GDP. And it fell to -5 in the aftermath, and now it's running about +7.
So 15 up to the global financial crisis, and then -5 after.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Spain, on the other hand, went from about 80% of GDP in roughly the start of the euro to 220% of GDP by the time the crisis hit. Credit demand hit 35%, almost 40% of GDP, and fell to -10 and has not recovered. It temporarily hit positive for a short while in 2015 or 16, but it's been negative all the way through. So what you've had, courtesy of the imposition of the austerity policy, is not just a lack of government stimulus. It's also being a private sector that's continuing to delever, and therefore you have two things sucking demand out of the economy. The only way you can compensate is for GDP to continue falling.
So how much of that, though, is the fault of the idea of the euro, and how much of it is just the way that it's been implemented? How much of it, in other words, is this idea of, well, we must have austerity to get ourselves out of a crisis rather than growing out of a crisis?
Well, it isn't just austerity as part of the crisis. The whole focus of the euro was the belief in responsible government spending, as it's defining responsible, meaning keeping government debt low, as if that had been proven to be the cause of all previous financial crises, when quite the opposite is the case. Work by my colleague Richard Vague has shown that every last crisis that's occurred in the last 1.5 centuries, in about 150 of them around the globe, have always been private debt crises, not government debt crises. Right. But the obsession about low government debt is a German thing, particularly. Swallowed by a lot of neoliberal economists as well, and neoliberal politicians who parrot what their economists tell them. So that combined with the 3% maximum deficit target was that was built into the design of the euro. Now, if at the same time the euro had involved transfers between countries running internal trade deficits, then it would have been nowhere near as extreme. But of course, it didn't involve that. So if you were running if you had a trade deficit with Germany, and most of Europe has a trade deficit with Germany, and you also had higher inflation than Germany, and no, we're not talking massively larger inflation. Italy's inflation rate is a whole 3% over the. Actually, closer to 2%, which is the target set in the treaties that formed the euro, a 2% inflation rate. Germany's hit 1%. Well, over 20 years, that gives you more than a 20% cost advantage for German goods versus Italian goods. So all these things could have been fixed up if there was an internal transfer mechanism, as in taxes paid in Germany would be distributed to spending in Greece and Spain. Yeah, that happens in America, but not in Europe.
Yeah, well, and of course it happens if you look at if we looked at Europe as one country rather than a series of countries with one currency, then what would happen? You would, as happens in Britain or any country which is concerned about the regional dispersal of the economy, you'd say, well, okay, we're going to invest in those areas which need that investment, because otherwise you'd have the same issue in the UK, wouldn't you? Well, we do to a great extent.
Well, you do to some extent, yeah.
But I mean, not as bad. It would be worse, exactly. And so if you look at Europe the same as a country, then it's very easy to see, isn't it? Just not investing in regional aid and regional assistance. But the problem is in Europe,
a depopulation of those areas. Again, something that Wynne Godley spoke about in 1992. Yeah. And it's even happening in countries which are considering joining the euro, such as Croatia, who has then part of the conditions to become part of the euro is to achieve these targets for government spending. And achieving those targets for government spending, it means if you do have a depressed region, you effectively can't do anything about it. So I was driven, I've spoken a few times in Croatia, and I was driven once from Zagreb down to Pula. And as we went through a couple of the villages, my hosts and driver casually remarked that these villages have no more people living in them. And I said, where have they gone? They said Zagreb or the European Union. So what you have is courtesy of this inability to spend, you have depopulation of areas that aren't growing, rather than government spending to compensate for the fact that they're not growing.
So surely Europe has, if it's to continue to survive, it needs to address that issue of regional imbalances, just as any country does. Otherwise, you become massively unpopular. You can't have one center of the economy which is making all the money, which is what we're seeing with Germany. It's what we're seeing to an extent, as we say, with London and the southeast in the UK. So shouldn't the focus be on a more equal spread for the economy? And can you do that still with the euro?
You could, but and you certainly could have done it if it was formed in 1948, 1449. But forming it in 1999, after Europe had got over the Second World War, and when you had an end to that, not an end, but a decline in that feeling of complete solidarity in Europe, after getting a bit of mild punishment of the Germans, nothing like what happened after the First World War. And you've got to give credit to the leaders back then who decided not to be vindictive in the way that the French was vindictive on the Germans after the First World War.
Right.
But it would have been politically possible then, to some extent, to talk about a union, even though. You imagine somebody talking about the Asian Union. China and Japan joining together after the Second World War. Never would have happened. The cultures are just too different, even though they use the same script. In Europe, of course, you have the same level of disparities and so on, and the same identification with a national, which is effectively the same in America, having an identification with Alabama rather than America. Now, there are some Americans who are like that, but the level of spending by the American government is several orders larger, several sizes larger than state or local spending. Whereas in Europe, I think the total deficit of the European Union itself is of the order of 2% of GDP, total accumulated debt. And all the European revenue systems do is finance the operations of the European Union. And by far, the majority of spending is done by the governments of Europe, which are equivalent in that sense to the states of the United States.
Yeah. So you think Germany, basically, it's too late now because Germany is just too big and too far ahead. And so Germany would have to feel a lot of hurt if we were to say, well, okay, let's try and create more unity across Europe. Germany would have to pay a lot for it, and then we just can't see that happening.
Well, in that sense, it's true, but Germans have also suffered because a major part of the way the European Union has tried to achieve competitiveness is by suppressing wage rises. And this is a major reason why Germany is more competitive and has a lower inflation rate than Italy. At the same time as they were pressuring the rest of Europe to cut back on wage rises, to cut back on inflation and hit their 2% target, they're pressuring Western German unions not to put up wage demands. So in many ways, West German workers have suffered courtesy with this whole thing, not as much as Europe, as Italian or Greek workers, obviously, but they've certainly suffered compared to a program that focused upon industrial growth and investment rather than cutting costs.
And yet, if we look at the Gini coefficient, I don't know whether you think the Gini coefficient is an effective way of measuring, the diversity or the egalitarianism of society. I guess it's a measure, isn't it, of wage discrepancies or income discrepancies. If we look at it for the EU 28 to 2016, it's around 33. The US is over 38, and the European number has actually fallen since the early 90s. So up to 2016, if you believe those figures, then Europe is becoming more equal rather than rich and poor suffering a bigger divide.
Yeah, well, I think that they relate. I mean, the Gini coefficient is an accurate, a good measure of inequality. There are others that are better. There's a measure called the Thiel measure, which my good friend Jamie Galbraith prefers to use. But in what he called the YouTube, the University of Texas Inequality Project, recommended for those who want to research inequality properly. But what that really says is you haven't had the same wage dispersal within the finance sector versus the rest of the economy, and not the same dispersal between workers and capitalists as you've had in the rest of the global economy, like America in particular. So it's the absence of those factors that mean you have a more equal distribution within the European Union compared to America, and certainly compared to the UK as well. But it's not the case that represents achievements in inequality caused by the euro. It's really that, probably it's partly cultural. There's actually one book I'd recommend to people to get a feeling on European capitalism versus American capitalism, and for that matter, Japanese. There's a book by a guy called Andrew Schonfeld called, I think, Modern Capitalism, written about 30-something years ago or 40 years ago. I read it back in my undergraduate days. But it gave you a feeling for the different characteristics of different national classes of capitalism. And in that sense, the Americans are much more devil take the hindmost, whereas the Europeans had that more of that social democratic tradition way back then. So you're not going to get the same, if you had the same level of inequality within European Union as you have in America, then I think the whole thing would have been toast long ago.
But you'd have to say, up to the global financial crisis, those countries of Central and Eastern and Southern Europe have increased their average income relative to those richer European nations. So that has to be a good thing, doesn't it?
Well, it depends on how it's been financed. And again, it's financed by a credit bubble. Again, to give the figures for Spain, amongst the most dramatic, not the most by far, but certainly close. When the euro began, Spain's private debt level had been pretty much constant since 1964. It's fluctuated up and down a bit, but it was about, and I'm just looking for, I can't get full accurate figures off this graph, but it was about 70-80% of GDP. As soon as the euro comes into existence, bang, a huge credit bubble in Spain. That's what really financed the increase in incomes. And that took debt from 80% to 220% of GDP in less than a decade. Now, if you spend, and that's coming out at about 1.4 times GDP, if you spend 1.4 times additional GDP, as GDP is rising too, with a credit foundation, you're going to look pretty damn good. But it then comes crashing down. So in some ways, what the euro did was accentuate the credit instability aspects of capitalism that Hyman Minsky warned about.
But if you didn't have the euro and everyone just kept their own currencies, but we were developing this free trade agreement involving 28 different countries, 28 diverse economies, you would, as we see in free trade agreements, we'd have countries saying, well, okay, you can't subsidize, you can't undercut us with government subsidies to sell on this open market. We'd still have that same issue, wouldn't we? We'd still have.
But you'd have currency devaluations.
But you'd also have governments saying you can't put money in to subsidise your industry and compete unfairly, which of course is the argument we're getting between China and the United States at the moment.
Yeah, well, in that sense, it's the euro has always been a neoliberal project, and this is one reason I've been a critic of it from the outset, because people, this particularly I think comes from people who are European. Of course, I'm an Australian, Johnny come lately in terms of arriving in the European Union in 2014. And I didn't, of course, I'm too young to have experienced the Second World War. And my parents didn't experience the Second World War. So I don't have that same, we must keep together at all costs feeling. That's obviously a large part of the political sentiment towards the European Union amongst Europeans. But that also means that I can sit outside it and say, just who wrote this stuff? Who drafted it? And it's just a completely neoliberal idea of making government as small as possible, eliminating as many controls on private behaviour as possible, allowing free movement of labour and capital, and no matter what. It's basically it's Paul Samuelson's textbook as a constitution.
Well, Vince Cable is saying, from the...
Oh, boy, that's going to be trustworthy. Yeah, what's he saying?
Well, he's saying we should stay in Europe to reform it. That should be...
Oh, yeah. I went when I was coming out and saying I was for Brexit, not because of what I thought it would do to the UK necessarily, but because of what I thought of the European Union itself. I made a comment about being undemocratic, and somebody on Twitter, forgotten who it was, Andrew somebody or other, I think, popped me a tweet saying, look, it's democratic, here's the structure. Well, I just basically burst out laughing. First of all, the politicians can't draft the laws in the European Parliament. They're drafted by the bureaucrats. Well, gee, that's good. get a job in the European Union and start drafting laws. And guess what qualifications you need to get a job in the European Commission.
Okay, before you finish this point off, but the irony is if we accept Theresa May's deal, and the arrangement that we've got, we're going to have a whole swag of European regulations, which are going to be redrafted by the bureaucrats in Whitehall. Rather than by politicians. So we're going to have exactly the same situation.
You can change them. You can change those. I mean, one of the whole proposals was to adopt the entire lot holus bolus and then go through and knock off the ones you don't like, which was quite feasible early on. Now, she's been outmaneuvered by the bill. And this is, again, Giannis's point. Don't try to negotiate with these bastards. They'll run you around like crazy. Nobody will ever be home when you knock on their door. It'll be somebody else's responsibility every change you want to make. You're stuck with what they want, and they want to expand the European Union. And when you read Juncker's ridiculous set of tweets and all the pay-ins to the euro that have been published out of Brussels over the last month and a half, you can see why they are wedded to this, because it's their belief system.
Well, not all, obviously. But is Juncker part of the problem? I mean, is he the main problem, actually? I mean, if you look at the day before the Brexit vote, Juncker was there saying, well, you're not going to, Britain's not going to get any more out of Europe than it already does. He was baiting people almost to vote for Brexit. And he does seem to enjoy, when he's sober, he seems to enjoy grandstanding and giving us a hard time. I wonder whether he's actually the main problem. And I'm just wondering if there's a way that, is it the euro that's the problem, or is it the EU and the way it behaves? And if there was an approach which was, yes, we need to ensure that there is a balance of income across the EU, and if that means some countries have got to pay from their taxes or from their governments money to other governments, just as some states in the United States subsidise other states, and just as people in the south of England pay for the maintenance of facilities in the north of England. If we took that approach, it wouldn't be a bad place, would it?
Wouldn't be as bad. I mean, you still have the issue of the absence of tax redistribution or revenue redistribution through the government. But I take your point. It's partly people like Juncker and they're just blind weddedness to the European Union. I must say, actually, that I got a surprise to see a tweet by Vito Constanzo, who's one of the executives of the European Central Bank, effectively is mildly but nonetheless saying we have to reform the Maastricht Treaty to allow more fiscal flexibility for the states of the European Union. Right. And I wrote to him and said, like, I'm delighted to see you say that. He said, I've been saying it for a while. You haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but he sent me an article of his, I think, from 2014, arguing the same case. So there is internal pressure for reform. But again, if you read Yanis Varoufakis's Adults in the Room, you'll see that the whole thing is politically was dominated by Schäuble. Now that Schäuble's not there anymore, it looks like Juncker's in a dominant way. And there is no democratic decision-making process within it. The decisions are made by the finance ministers. In the past, they all kowtowed, quite literally, to Schäuble. Now they seem to be effectively admonished by Juncker, but on that front, he's not as strong a personality as Schäuble was. So it comes down to the strength of the personalities rather than the democratic process, which I think the European Union is almost devoid of. So
how would you reform the Maastricht Treaty then? What if it was possible with the politics? What sort of reforms would you introduce?
Well, one I would actually bring, it sounds quite crazy, but it's quite simple. Any country that underachieved the inflation target would be forced to pay its workers higher wages to cause the inflation, because that's what actually I think is in many ways has caused the whole thing to come unstuck. This isn't my idea. I met an economist at an Italian conference who made this case, and I think it's quite sensible. If the inflation rates had been the same across the whole of the European Union, then the gaps in competitiveness that have broken up over the last 20 years wouldn't have occurred. So in that sense, even the 3% rule would have been easier to bear with. But because Germany underperformed on the inflation deliberately by pushing down wages, by telling its trade unions to demand lower wage rises, that's given Germany a low rate of inflation, and that's caused the massive imbalances that have led to Germany having effectively a 10% of GDP trade surplus, which is a world bloody record, but it's not the sort of world record you want.
What would happen if you just said that? Well, the same minimum wage across the whole of the EU. I mean, that would be
that unfortunately is impossible because you have a huge difference in the industrial strength of the different countries. So Germany, imagine Germany's wage in in Greece would bankrupt any Greece manufacturers of anything. Because the technology advantage, this is the.
But if you're looking for unity, ultimately, I mean, I'm not saying you do it in one go, but if you say in 10 years that's where we want to be, and progressively this is what we're going to do, we you can set targets in terms of wage levels and say we want to reach a minimum wage in terms of local costs. I wouldn't do it away from looking at local cost levels as well. Yeah.
If you go to Spain and see what you can buy in Spain with a euro versus what you can buy in the Netherlands or Germany, then there are advantages. So I think that would have been a reasonable idea, and that would be a non-neoliberal target because it would say that the purpose of this is to improve working standards of the average person, which I don't think you would find in the principles of the European Union.
And how do you stop the massive migration that we have been seeing, which seems to be the fundamental problem that most people have?
Well, I think it's again the problem of belief that the free movement of labour and capital is a desirable social objective. Free movement of capital is what's given us tax havens. And that even within the European Union, that's causing hassles because of the way Ireland has exploited that for its own advantage. But free movement of labour works when there's not push factors pushing people out of their own countries. Normally, you don't migrate for the fun of it. You migrate if you get a better job offer, and that's the case for moving from Australia to the UK in the first instance, or you migrate if you're being bombed, the shit's been bombed out of your country, which is what's happening in Syria. So if you remove the push factors, if all the economies are growing comfortably, you wouldn't have had the scale of movement of people that we've seen anyway. It would have been people moving for job-specific reasons or for lifestyle reasons, but it wouldn't have been the huge movement we're seeing. Yeah, in fact, you might have seen migration from the northern to the southern to enjoy a better climate. But free movement of capital and certainly has been a major cause of the disparities in the UK, in the European Union, and free movement of labour as well. I'm very much a fan of migration as a way of mixing cultures, but I do appreciate the argument people make in the opposite direction. You want to be able to maintain your cultural integrity. You can do that only with a low level of migration, not when it becomes an overwhelming one.
Well, surely you can do it by saying, well, okay, you can only come here if you've got a job. If you can't speculate and be unemployed in a country for a long time, but within Europe, if you want to move for work, if you've got a job, then sure, move.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what the UK is trying to bring in, of course, with the usual obnoxious elements that the UK under May loves adding to things like that.
Well, like saying you've got to have an income of £30,000.
That's right. Yeah, you can move if you're wealthy.
Yeah,
it's hardly wealthy being £30,000, but a lot of European, British workers earn a lot less than that. Not
many fruit pickers earning that amount of money, for example.
Not many nurses
restaurant
either.
Workers or
not
nurses,
many nurses
absolutely.
either, and a few bloody academics and journalists it's just appalling.
Academics and journalists. We don't need those. Look, what about if the euro? Because a lot of what we've been saying today is that it's not the euro so much as the policy that sits alongside it. If we did, and of course the euro started as the ECU, the European Currency Unit, which was a trading unit between different countries. Is there any reason why we couldn't go back to that? What impact would that have? So if we had a euro and local currencies, in other words, can they coexist?
Yeah, I think they can coexist, and this is one thing I've been arguing for a while, that the euro should return to being an European currency for international trade while they themselves operate with their own national currencies. That'd be an effective arrangement.
Yeah,
and if that's something which the European Union would consider, then we might get out of this hellhole. But you can tell from Juncker and the pay end of the 20th anniversary of something that has increased sovereignty. Holy shit! There's no way he's going to back down on. You're dealing with people who are delusional.
Well, while countries have given away basically their economies to the euro, what do their central banks do? Because we have the European Central Bank, obviously, which determines monetary policy for the eurozone. But I mean, there's still a Greek central bank. What does it do?
It's pretty much a branch of the European Central Bank. I mean, if you look at what happened under the Syriza government in Greece, the one thing the European Union said was at one point they shut the ATMs down, and the power to do that resided with the governor of the Central Bank of Greece, and he damn well went and did it. So in that sense, they're branches. Some of them also have printing presses. Unfortunately, the Greeks destroyed. This is also required as part of joining the union. You had to destroy your printing presses to create your local currency, and then in some cases you have local currencies for printing particular denominations of the euro currency. But I don't believe Greece has any.
I think they print some euros. I think they've got a little Y.
Maybe, but there's a small denomination. I mean, if you could print the 50 and the 20 and 50 euro notes, and just go gangbusters printing those under national direction. If Syria had occupied the central bank, which frankly I think they should have done, because it's a foreign. It's not like independence. It's a foreign domination of your central bank, but they didn't do that. And so partly the process of shutting down the Greek financial system, which was a large part of the blackmail that was used to try to get people to vote for the European Union's austerity proposals in Greece, that's been the function of those central banks.
And how much of the dissatisfaction that we're seeing now in Europe is economic, and how much? So, for example, the yellow vest protest that we're seeing in France, which actually started as an opposition to a fuel tax, which you would have thought actually would be a good environmental story, but that's what kicked it all off. But it seems to be getting worse and worse. But there's a lot more authoritarianism coming out of all of this as well. I mean, the French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe is now planning to ban unauthorized protests. And you can't wear masks at demonstrations and that sort of thing. It's all becoming quite heavy-handed, which is nothing to do with the economy, but I guess they are linked in some ways. I mean, we are seeing disunity, the complete opposite of what Jean-Claude Juncker said is happening in Europe. We're seeing the complete opposite of it. How much of that is economics, and how much of it is politics? And this belief,
economics has caused the politics.
Yeah,
and this is the horrifying thing, that this failed economic policy, a failed vision of how the economy operates, is leading to the exact opposite of what the European Union was supposed to achieve, which is bringing Europeans peacefully together. In fact, it's making them war with each other, not at the moment across national boundaries, but certainly within, because the people who are suffering from this are the workers and the unemployed and the low paid. And this is the classic Macron thing: I'll go get a better paid job, as if it's your fault that nurses and doctors get paid lousy wages.
Yeah, crazy argument, isn't it? So if Europe goes from bad to worse, whether Britain is part of it or not, can you see the euro collapsing? I mean, I think your vision is that, or your belief is, anyway, I don't know if it's a vision, that might be going a bit far, but your belief is that the EU is going to fall apart once Britain leaves. But
not so much when Britain left. There's also Britain being the sort of soft option. If Italy left, then yes, you'd be talking about a breakdown of the euro. I hope it breaks down.
Of the euro or of the EU?
If one goes, I think the other will follow.
Does it, or does the disappearance of the euro actually save the EU, where everyone goes, well, okay, we just need to go back to being a trading bloc?
It could do that, but if you're going to have people who are willing to take a backward step, and I certainly haven't seen that capacity amongst the European Union leaders.
Interesting times, isn't it? This is all going to steamroll quite quickly, I think, this year.
Well, the yellow vest is a major factor there, and particularly if they start, apparently I saw a comment this morning saying that semi-automatic weapons have been issued to the police to fight them now. If you start having French people being shot by the French police, or particularly as we're now seeing there is a European army. If the European army moves in there to help suppress it, then yes, okay, we could see international conflicts breaking out within Europe because of the European Union.
Well, I hope you're wrong. Let's follow this.
So do I.
We'll follow this story. I'm sure we'll talk about it in future editions of the podcast. Great to talk, Steve.
Thanks, mate.
And that is it for now. Next time, economic theory and the digital economy. How much are we trying to apply theories developed for production-based economies and applying them to economies driven by knowledge, particularly when a lot of those initial theories were wrong in the first place? We'll look at the economic theory and the digital economy next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.